All right, bailiff, if you'd bring jurors in, please. All right, arguments for the defendant, and we'll hear first from Ms. Hamburger.
Good afternoon. On April 9th, 2014, Nate Holden inflicted horrific pain on his family, on his children. Pain and trauma that they will live with for the rest of their lives. He put the lives of officers of the law at risk. Officers just doing their job, serving their communities. You have found Nate Holden guilty of first-degree murder. That means that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. He will live in a tiny cell, away from his family and children. He will be told what to do and when to do it for the rest of his life, and he will never be released. You, with your verdict on Monday, you have assured that. We're here right now because the state of North Carolina is arguing to you that life in prison is not enough punishment for Nate Holden. They are asking you to send Nate not just to prison, but to death row, to await his execution, to await death. And you've had a chance to hear the prosecutor's arguments for why you should do this. And I think if you were listening, you heard they made it sound kind of like a formula. Calculate the weight of the bowling balls and calculate the weight of the feathers, arrive at the right answer. This is not a math problem. Yes, the law provides you with a process to guide you in this decision, but make no mistake. The ultimate question before you is the value of this man's life. As you consider the circumstances, as you weigh them, that is the question. And the law never requires a death sentence. It certainly does not require a death sentence in this case. You, the members of the jury, you get to determine whether Nate's life still has value, even despite what he did. We sometimes talk about the death penalty as being reserved for the worst of the worst. The term I think the state used was the egregious case. We talk about it being for the worst offenders, for the most inhuman acts. But what could possibly be more human than the story that has unfolded in this courtroom? In the first phase, we heard about two Nate Holdens. There was the father and husband who wasn't perfect, but he tried his best, loved his family. And then there was the Nate Holden who committed the terrifying acts of April 9th, 2014. And I know you may have been left wondering why. Yes, he was upset about the separation, the child custody situation. Obviously, that was a very important factor. But where did that violence come from? And now, with the evidence we presented in the sentencing phase, you at least begin to have an answer to that question, starting with the violence in his childhood. So here is Nate's elementary school photo. You saw this. He's little kid here. A really sweet child. That's what one teacher described him as in elementary school in his school records. This is Nate, a child. And what was happening at home when this photo was taken? This little boy, sleeping in his bunk bed, woken up in the middle of the night to another fight. His mother, the little chihuahua, going after his father for being out with other women. His father shouting back about her drinking. The sound of things breaking. The sound of his father's fists. The sound of his mother screaming. And his little sister crying. Crawling into his bed, he tries to comfort her, but he's just a little boy. And then, if it got really bad, you heard what Katina would do. She would slide down between the bed and the wall to protect herself. And little Nate would venture out there into the night. You heard what Goldie said he would say. He said, "Dad, stop hitting my mama." Maybe they would get to sleep. Maybe Dad would leave. Maybe things would calm down. Maybe he'd get back to sleep, and the next morning, come out, see the house, broken plates, holes in the walls. Maybe Dad's gone, not sure when he's coming back. And what else would he see? His mother's bruises. Bruises like these. Maybe worse. Maybe so bad she had to stay home from work. And then Nate and his little sister, he probably helped her get ready for school, don't you think? Off they go to school. And you could hear in their testimony, the brave testimony of his family, you could hear the responsibility his family put on him in these situations. This little boy tasked with keeping his mother safe. This little boy tasked with controlling his father's temper, with keeping chaos at bay. But he didn't really have that power, did he? Because sometimes Nate couldn't break up the fight. Sometimes he could, and sometimes he couldn't. And of course this trauma impacted him. And don't you think that seeing this on a regular basis might result in distressing and intrusive memories that would be a symptom of PTSD? I don't think the fact that Nate had to self-report that suggests that that's not true. Of course you'd have intrusive memories about witnessing this on a daily basis or a regular basis when you're a child. Regardless of whether there's a PTSD diagnosis or not. Of course this impacted him. How could it not? As Nate got older, he began to see that he didn't want to live like this for the rest of his life, to his credit. But what's the solution? He wasn't being modeled appropriate ways of behaving. He came up in his childish mind with his own solution. If I don't like what I'm seeing, I'm going to do the opposite. If I see hitting, I'm not going to hit. I see infidelity, so I'm not going to cheat. I see separation, okay, well then don't leave. Stay in the marriage. I see anger, I'm not going to feel anger. I see an unhappy family, I will make a happy family. And if I do these things, and if I do them just right, everything will be fine and happy. And it's all up to me. It's always all been up to me since I was a little boy trying to keep my dad from killing my mom. It's all up to me to keep my family intact. And given everything, he managed amazingly well. You saw JT testify. What a lovely young man Nate and LaTanya raised. But life doesn't always go according to our plans, right? In fact, does it ever go according to our plans? The question isn't if hard times will come, but when. And when they do, how will we deal with them? And learning how to deal with hard times is a lifelong process, right? But if we're lucky, we got some wisdom along the way, some wisdom from our parents or our grandparents. But the trauma and dysfunction in Nate's family left him with no healthy coping skills. This was the wisdom that his family imparted to him. Both parents had their ways of coping. Dad had his women. Mom had her alcohol and her drugs. And Nate developed his own coping skill, LaTanya. All his hopes and dreams of safety and normality in this one beautiful person. Here's the photo of their wedding day. If you looked at it closely when it came around before, you could see the tears of joy in his eyes, and hers as well. Have you ever seen two young people looking so happy on their wedding day? But marriage is hard work, right? It's not a fairy tale. They had problems, typical problems, the kinds of problems lots of couples are able to work through. But where would Nate have learned how to work through those problems? Not at home, not with the trauma he endured. And then she left. And she didn't just leave. She tried to take the kids. There was the custody battle, the conflicts with Sylvester. This would have been a dark period in anyone's life, but even more to Nate, who'd built his whole identity on being a father and a husband. And even more so because he had no coping strategy to fall back on. He learned in childhood to stuff his feelings, especially anger, because he'd learned that anger meant violence and he didn't want to be violent. So he stuffed it. He stuffed it into that container that Dr. Blackshear talked about. But there was already a lot of stuff in that container. The abuse of his mother, the trauma of seeing her on the streets a crack addict, the baseball bat assault, the home invasion robbery. He couldn't stuff anymore. And he ended up reenacting what had been modeled for him, violence. In his effort to escape the violence of his childhood, he ended up tragically repeating the same pattern. A human story, the story of a family. Not a math problem, maybe something out of literature or psychology, but certainly not a math equation. The value of Nate's life cannot be boiled down to a formula. It is borne out in a whole collection of tiny moments, actions that are impossible to convey in a courtroom. But you've seen glimpses, or at least I hope you have. You've seen that brave testimony of his family members, talking about what went on in that home when he was a child. You've read his notebooks, turned the pages of his diary. And you've seen these photos. You've seen the image of him crying at his wedding. You've seen this image, his mom hugging him, or this one, snuggling with his goofy son, or this one, hanging out with his friends. And you've also, of course, seen the images of his beloved mother with her face swollen beyond recognition after a beating that Nate wasn't able to stop. And there are other images too, of course, that add up to the picture of who Nate Holden is and the value that his life has. Except they have to exist only in our imaginations, because there's no one with a photo there to take a picture when Nate was standing between his parents, a young boy trying to hold them off each other. When he was huddling with his sister in their bunk bed, while it sounded like their entire world was falling down around them. When he was crying at his high school graduation, when he should have been celebrating his achievement because his mother was living on the streets, addicted to crack. There's also the image of Nate kneeling in the woods, having just done the most terrible thing of his life, praying that the officers would just shoot him. In that moment, Nate saw no value in his life. And now, amazingly, that decision, That decision about how to place a value on this man's human life, that's placed in your hands, your 24 hands. This is not a case that calls for the death penalty. Please return a verdict of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hamburger. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. Do we kill Nate Holden, or do we condemn him to a life imprisonment without the possibility of ever being released? That's what this case is all about now. Nothing else. By your verdicts earlier this week, you have ensured that Nate will be punished for what happened on April 9th, 2014. You have ensured that he will be punished severely. You have ensured that that severe punishment will last the rest of his life. Now you will decide what form that severe and harsh punishment will take. The death penalty is never automatic. Life imprisonment without parole is always a possibility. When we started talking about the law with most of you back in January, some of you in February, and every one of you said that you could consider a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, even for cases of first-degree murder that were premeditated and deliberate. And you all certainly said that you could consider life imprisonment without parole for cases of felony murder. You know that life without parole is harsh, it's severe, and in this case, it is the appropriate punishment. And if you spend a few moments to go through the law that we've talked about back in jury selection and was touched on by the prosecutors in their argument, and will be touched on more by Judge Ridgway. But it's the 4 steps that we talked about, the 4-step process, the 4 issues that you're going to get tomorrow to consider. And the first is, do you unanimously and beyond a reasonable doubt find the existence of an aggravating circumstance? There'll be 1 aggravating circumstance for your consideration. And if you find beyond a reasonable doubt and unanimously the existence of an aggravating circumstance in this case, then you will continue the process. But if you don't so find, if you're not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, the process will stop. And Judge Ridgway will enter a sentence, and Nate Holden will be punished, and he will be punished severely, and he will be punished harshly, and he will be punished with life imprisonment without parole. And the second issue concerns mitigating circumstances. And you're going to be given a list of mitigating circumstances. I believe that you're going to be considered 38 circumstances for your consideration. And this is going to be an individual choice. Each of you, taking your life experience, your values, and what you heard in this courtroom and the evidence, you will decide each of those mitigating circumstances for yourself. What exists and what things in there help show that life imprisonment tends to be the more appropriate punishment. And let's stop for a second and say what these mitigating circumstances are. These are not being offered to you as excuses for what happened. They are not justifications for what happened. And Judge Ridgway is going to tell you that that's the case, that that is not mitigating circumstances. They are things about the crime, but also about the defendant's record, his background, his character, that tend to show that instead of that one harsh punishment, life imprisonment, life imprisonment without parole, tends to be the more appropriate punishment in the case, as opposed to another harsh punishment, the death penalty. And when you hear about these factors that you each consider individually to yourself, whether they exist, you will hear that they don't even have to have a connection to the crime for them to be mitigating, for them to have value, for them to be something that you can consider. And so each of you should come into it, and you should take your own values, your own life experience, and discuss it among the group, but in the end, consider them, and consider the effects that all of it have, and why life imprisonment, and why they tend to show that life imprisonment without parole is the appropriate punishment in this case. Once you decide what mitigating circumstances come in, the next step, let me make sure, second, that you all can see it, is do you unanimously find beyond a reasonable doubt that the mitigating circumstances found by you are insufficient to outweigh the aggravating circumstances that were found unanimously by you beyond a reasonable doubt? That's the kind of that weird lawyer talk, one that we mentioned beforehand. What it is you're going to weigh the circumstances. And when you do that, keep this in mind. You are weighing the aggravating circumstances that were found beyond a reasonable doubt unanimously by each of you versus the mitigating circumstance that each of you found as individuals, that each of you considered to be important. And you decide those circumstances. And you come over and you discuss it. And you decide as a group and as individuals how much weight to give that circumstances. You'll be given some instructions, but determining the weight, that's going to be up to each of you as an individual, and then discussing it as a group. And should you determine, and if only if you determine beyond a reasonable doubt that the aggravating circumstances outweigh the mitigating circumstances, and you decide that unanimously, then the process continues. But when you look at the individual mitigating circumstances that each of you found individually, and if you think, upon considering out, that there is the possibility that the mitigating circumstances outweigh the aggravating circumstances, then you would answer that question, no. And if you answer it no, then the process would end. And Judge Ridgway would sentence the defendant. He would sentence him harshly. He would sentence him severely. But he would sentence him to life imprisonment without parole. If and only if you answer this issue 3, yes, you would then go to issue number 4. And that, the question is, do you find unanimously and beyond a reasonable doubt that the aggravating circumstances are sufficiently substantial to call for the imposition of the death penalty? But still, considering the mitigating circumstances that each of you found for yourself. You still don't forget about the mitigating circumstances, about the things about his background, about his character that call for the life sentence, even at this step. And only if you find that the aggravating circumstances, even when considered with the mitigating circumstances, are so sufficiently substantial that it causes the imposition of the death penalty, would you vote yes and the death penalty would be imposed? But if you aren't so convinced, if you have a reasonable doubt about the existence whether these aggravating circumstances are so sufficiently substantial that the death penalty is the only appropriate punishment, then you would answer that question, no. And if you do that, Nate will be punished. He will be punished severely. He will be punished harshly, but he will be punished appropriately with a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, without any possibility of ever being released. The reason we have the law like this is that the death penalty is not appropriate for every first-degree murder. It is reserved for the worst of the worst. Not only for those whose crimes are the worst of the worst, but for the worst of the worst people. And that simply is not Nate Holden. As tragic and heartbreaking as these crimes are, they do not prove that Nate is the worst of the worst. They don't prove that he is so beyond redemption that the only possible punishment is death. The worst of the worst, those who've killed before, those whose history is so terrible that execution is the only way to ensure that they don't kill again. Those whose crime actions are so calculating, cruel, and depraved that only the death penalty can protect society. But that is not Nate. Here is a man without hardly any criminal record at all. His prior criminal convictions consist of traffic offenses and 2 misdemeanors, despite the fact that he was already 30 years old. This is a man who, as a result of a perfect storm of events on April 9th, 2014, snapped and did things out of his character. He is a man who the prison system can control, who will never be a threat to his society if he is allowed to live the rest of his life in prison. We are not claiming that before April 9th, 2014, that Nate was a perfect man, a perfect husband, or a perfect father. But he was a decent human being. He loved his family. His children loved him. He worked to earn a living and help support his family. LaTanya said he was not violent towards her. And other than the broom incident with JT, there was no history of violence with his children or with anywhere of his family. What happened that night? It's hard to exactly say. But of course, any understanding goes back to what happened when he was growing up. His mom suffered from serious cognitive problems. Her verbal IQ was 65. Her overall IQ, I believe, was 72. And she was an alcoholic from the time Nate was born to the present day. And then later, when he was in high school, she became addicted to crack. And his father would fool around with all sorts of women. And when his mom would confront his dad about the infidelity, which happened on a regular basis, the two of them would fight. Not argue. Fight. As in fist fights. And you've seen the pictures, but you heard the words beforehand, and you saw what those fights were like. And Nate grew up hearing and watching his mom get beat up regularly by his dad. That is not an excuse for what happened on April 9th, 2014. But it is mitigation. Nate himself tried to make sure that he was not going to be that type of person. He married the woman who was the mother of his child. And then though there were problems in his marriage, he did not physically abuse her. He tried to be an active part of his children's life. Nate tried to overcome the scars of his childhood. For most of the first 30 years of his life, he tried to be a decent person. He was not a perfect man, a perfect father, or a perfect husband, but a decent person. But growing up in a home where your father, where your mom has such cognitive problems, is going to leave scars. Growing up where your mother is an alcoholic and then a crack addict can leave scars. Growing up in a home where your father regularly beat up your mother to the point that it left bruises on a regular basis, it's going to leave scars more than his mom. It's going to leave scars on their children. Nate never had any help in overcoming these problems, never had any professional help. And although he tried to be his best beforehand, it left scars. Is any of this a justification for what happened on April 9th? No. Is it an excuse? No. But it's mitigation. It gives us some insight into what happened. It's a reason to give him one harsh punishment, one severe punishment, life imprisonment without parole, over another harsh punishment, the death penalty. Like lots of marriages, Nate and LaTanya had their problems, and like so many marriages, began to dissolve. Divorce is never easy for anyone, but it was especially difficult for Nate. It was especially difficult for Nate because he had never been through anything like this beforehand. Most of us experience some type of breakup early in our lives. For most of us it's painful, but we have the resources and the get-go to get through it. But Nate had been together with LaTanya since the two of them had been in middle school. Nate had never experienced a breakup beforehand. But it was also difficult because of Nate's own life growing up. LaTanya was more than his wife, his friend, and the mother of his children. She was his escape. She was the one who allowed him to get away from his other family, that violent and chaotic family that you heard about. She was the one who provided him with normalcy and showed him what real love was. And so it was not surprising that he reacted with such depression and sadness to the breakup. You heard testimony from Dr. Blackshear about how all of this affected basically this person who up until then was basically a decent man. How the combination of all the trauma he experienced to the sadness and depression over the possibility of losing his family, how all of this basically caused him to snap and to do something that was completely at odds with his character. But you probably didn't even need Dr. Blackshear to tell you how this type of trauma, this type of effects was going to have on somebody. He may be able to talk about how it specifically affected Nate, but our own experience talks about how this can have an effect. And now Nate, as he should, will pay the price for what happened that day for the rest of his life. His family was everything to Nate. And part that clearly affected him that night was the feeling that he was losing everything. Of course, we now know, looking at the situation and from the perspective that we have from the outside and looking back, that he had not really lost everything at that night. When he lost everything was when he killed Mr. and Mrs. Taylor and assaulted LaTanya. Now he really has lost his family. He has lost his freedom. He has lost almost everything that has made his life worth living. It explains, if anything can, his actions that night. Things that happened before and afterwards. The shooting at those police officers sounds more like somebody trying to commit suicide by cop rather than someone trying to escape. His statements to the social workers afterwards were more self-destructive than anything. Even his letter to the divorce court that Mr. Waller read at the end of his closing argument sounded more like someone who had lost everything, not someone adequately dealing with his situation. Life in prison without the possibility of parole can adequately punish Nate. Our prison system can control him. You heard from Jim Aiken, who has spent a lifetime evaluating and classifying inmates. He told you that our prison system can control Nate Holden. That Nate will not be a threat to guards, other prisoners, or anybody else. Yes, Nate's not been a perfect prisoner. Few are. But he can be controlled. Given his age, his criminal record, his lack of gang activity, he is not someone the prison system has to be worried about. And prison is real punishment. Every aspect of your life is controlled. You are told where to sleep, where to eat, what to do. 24/7. Yes, they provide you the basics to allow you to live when you are in prison. Yes, if you need laxatives, you will get them. But you lose every freedom that would be precious to any of us. No one should dispute what a punishment prison is. I think for most of us, prison sounds unbearable. It would be unbearable to go through it if you just had to be in prison for a week. But if someone were in prison for a week, he or she could stand it because he or she would know that after a week it would be over. And he or she would be getting out. If someone knew that they were going to prison for a year, it would be even more unbearable. But he or she could make it because you would know that after a year of prison, you will be getting out. If someone was going to be in prison for 10 years, that would be hard to imagine. It would be so unbearable. But even then, that person would know that after 10 years, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, that you would be getting out. There would at least be hope. But for Nate, there will be no such hope. He will never be getting out of prison. He will have no future to look forward to. For the rest of his life, he will wake up every day knowing, I am in prison. I will always be in prison. I will die in prison. Life imprisonment without parole is a terrible punishment, but appropriate punishment for anyone convicted of first-degree murder. But for Nate, there is additional punishment that he will receive. Throughout this trial, you have heard how important his children are to him, how they were his life. As a result of his crime, his convictions, and now his confinement, his relationship with his children will be changed forever. He won't be there for the high school graduations, for the future weddings, for future grandchildren, or for the more mundane things that can make having children, about having relationships, about having a family so important and so special. Cookouts, going to games together, just hanging out. Given what he did, and that he did it in front of him, his children may never want to have anything to do with him. And that's going to be part of his punishment for the rest of his life. For the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've heard a lot about the life of Nate Holden. We have heard about the tragic and senseless events of April of 2014. We've learned about his life that started from teenage parents who had their own problems with violence and drugs, and about how he continued to grow in that life. And we heard how it appeared for a while that perhaps he had escaped that because he had found a new family, and then how he could not, and then how his life took a turn when he could not deal with the separation from his family. And now we know how the story of Nate Holden's life will end. We know where it will end. It will end in prison. You will now decide how it will end. Punish Nate harshly. Punish him severely. But punish him appropriately and with compassion. Sentence Nate Holden to life imprisonment without parole. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brennan. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's close to 4 o'clock. The instructions will actually take some bit of time to read to you, and so we will recess today and resume tomorrow morning. So we'll start at 9:30. I'll read the instructions to you at that time, and then by mid-morning you'll be deliberating this matter. Again, all the rules continue to be very important. Don't talk about this case among yourselves or with anyone else. Don't form or express opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation, and no conversations with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. Please leave your notepads in your chairs. Gather in the deliberation room tomorrow morning at 9:30. Thank you very much for your service. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be in recess until 9:30 tomorrow morning. Is there anything that we need to take up? I can't think of anything. So all right. Thank you. We'll be in recess until 9:30.
Here, of course, is in recess until 9:30 tomorrow morning. God save the state and son of the court.